Thanks so much, Catherine, for that really generous introduction, and also for giving me the chance to discuss my work with such an expert audience. As a historian, it's sometimes difficult to directly engage with specialists in a field, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing all the feedback you might have and taking any advice you might have for me on board as far as where I might take this research in the future. So without further ado, I think I'll just jump right in. On New Year's Day 1955, 394 rhesus macaque travelling between Delhi and New York were found dead in a van at London Airport. The deaths caused widespread uproar. In the UK, the RSPCA called for the trade in monkeys to be halted. Similar outrage in India led to the immediate imposition of a ban on exports from the country. Yet despite the contentiousness of the deaths, exports quickly resumed. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru personally intervened to ensure the continuation of the trade. The reason, of course, was that rhesus macaque had suddenly become fundamental to modern medical practice. They were crucial in the manufacture of a then brand new vaccine for poliomyelitis. Jonas Salk's announcement of an effective polio vaccine on the 12th of April 1955 was in many ways a triumph of experimental medical research. Yet one significant fact has tended to be forgotten in histories of this moment of medical history. That is that the specific requirements of vaccine production had major effects on the international trade in animals, and specifically the monkey trade. The vaccine manufacturing and testing process required the use of rhesus spinal cords and kidneys in large numbers. Kidneys especially were used as a cultivation medium for the vaccine. And despite numerous attempts to find alternative methods of production, vaccine manufacturers continued to rely on the animals well into the 1970s and beyond. Suddenly, from 1955, entire scientific and political careers became dependent on continued supplies of rhesus. Import rates to the West from their native habitats in Asia skyrocketed. For example, from India, they increased from around 10,000 per year in the early 1950s to up to 200,000 a year by the end of the decade. So what I want to talk about with you today has less to do with the precise uses to which animals are put in laboratories, and that is with the classical object of animal regulation, the animal undergoing experiment that most discussions of 3Rs place center stage, than with the broader impacts and effects of the use of certain kinds of animal in the first place. As a historian, I'm trained to adapt as ethically neutral a stance as possible on the activities of historical actors and events. Whilst I may choose a certain topic because I wish to highlight what I perceive as injustice or harm, I don't aim to condemn certain individuals or institutions as inherently bad actors. So my concern today isn't to take a definitive stance on the current ethics of animal use or to evaluate whether particular institutions were right or wrong to adopt the policies they did. And I'm even less able to say whether past policies and actions have directly influenced those in place today, although I do hope my talk will help you draw your own conclusions in this regard. But what I do want to do as a historian, though, is to understand the ways that specific activities, in this case, specific approaches to the acquisition and supply of laboratory animals, emerge through time, and the forms of scientific and cultural justification that accompanied these approaches. So my goal in this talk isn't simply to relativize or dismiss the importance of this hugely ethically significant, politically loaded topic, but rather to try and open up a space from which to think about the use of laboratory animals and the emergence of the 3Rs from a new point of view. What I want to discuss today is a very particular moment in the formation of the discipline of laboratory animal science, the making of the rhesus macaque as the go-to primate in experimental biomedicine. And just to indicate the relevance of this to present-day biomedicine, I want to look at a few quotes from a just published National Academies of Science report on the use of non-human primates in biomedicine. I'm very grateful to Catherine for highlighting this report to me last week. So just to look at a few of these quotes, non-human primates will remain critical models in multiple areas of biomedical research for years to come because of the nation's most pressing public health needs and the evolving state of the science. Researchers are likely to require increased use of non-human primates in the future. This will be weighted towards macaques. And rhesus macaques, or macaque mulata, are likely to remain the predominant species under study in the future. So I think you can see from these quotes that for certain sections of the scientific community, it's become almost impossible, or at least very difficult to envisage a future research landscape that doesn't include the use of macaque for experimentation. And my question today really is, how did this come about? And my own answers to this, as you'll see, suggests that the reliance of scientists on rhesus has has less to do with their inherent qualities as animals and more to do with the emergence of a global infrastructure dedicated to supplying and using them. That is what I want to do, is show today how the dramatic expansion of rhesus use for polio vaccination created a set of legal and material institutions and pathways, which, once established, became almost impossible to imagine otherwise. So, following the maxim that biomedical science is what scientists do, many historical analyses of lab life and model animals tend to take the laboratory itself as their point of departure. They're interested in the creation of standardized animals, for example, in lab care concerns, experimentation practices, and so forth. So what I'm going to do today is really draw on this literature. People like Robert Kohler is writing on Drosophila, Karen Rader on the standardization of mice, and Leslie Sharp on human-animal interactions in labs are really good starting points for thinking about the way practices of science have been established over time. And I recommend anyone interested in the history of the field to look at these sources. But in contrast to these texts, what I want to do is start my analysis today not with laboratories themselves, but with the environments out of which laboratory animals initially came. So by following monkeys traded out of India, starting with their native forests, moving into the hands of trappers, then dealers and importers, and only after that into Western laboratories, my hope is that we might better understand what was and is at stake in the many-layered regime of care that grew up around laboratory animals from the 1950s. And what emerges from this analysis, I think, is that the logistical and legislative infrastructures that emerge around rhesus shouldn't be thought simply in terms of a set of Western attitudes and beliefs regarding animal care and the rights and wrongs of animal use and experiment, but rather they emerge through the interaction of multiple cultural and geographical differences operating on a global scale. Laboratory animal science is a global discipline and always has been. The cultures of care and exploitation enabled and prevented by it have global effects, and these effects seem to us particularly hard to undo or alter once they were put in place, precisely because they involve a whole set of economic and institutional forces that laboratory animal scientists themselves feel unable to alter or often indeed even criticize. So my contention is that it's only really by reframing animal science as a discipline concerned with logistics as much as it's concerned with care that we can understand the difficulties that many have with imagining a research landscape without non-human primates. How was the logistics of rhesus macaque supply organized during the 1950s? What changes had to take place to increase exports by a factor of at least 15 in a few short years? To understand this, we need to start with the forests of India. Ecologically speaking, rhesus macaque are native to the tropical forests of South and Southeast Asia. Monkeys and humans have a very long history of relations in this part of the world. And the oldest Indian literature shows that monkeys and man had actually come to a fairly mutual understanding by the time of the European Middle Ages. Yet by the early 20th century, the traditions that valued monkeys as guides to human life had come to be devalued significantly. European colonists brought their own values to the forests and animals of India. Jungle nature was for most colonists a symbol of chaos and disorder in need of control. So the forest appeared as a site of potential economic exploitation to colonists, somewhere that needed to be made valuable through the extraction of resources. Monkeys appeared to them as often as figures of fun and sport, objects of curiosity, but not morally or spiritually significant beings. And even apparently environmentally sensitive laws, such as India's 1912 Wild Birds and Animals Protection Act, actually aim to limit excessive hunting rather than prevent it. So Despite this, Indian forests and the monkeys that lived in them actually had become increasingly contested as the independence movement became more prominent in India during the 1920s and 30s. Whilst colonists continued to approach the forest as a site of development, Hindu anti-colonists had begun to claim the forest as a site of spiritual renewal. Hindu revivalism literalized the forest's spiritual power by the reclamation of villages desecrated by colonialism. And with the advent of independence in 1947, this only complicated matters further. India's new leaders promoted economic development above other strategies for national unification, and they thereby committed to secular economic improvement, that is, forest clearing, infrastructural development, and a move to mechanized agriculture, rather than cultural restitution or spiritual rebirth. And this became a point of deep contention in the new Indian state. So even before they were caught, monkeys found themselves tangled in a complex web of human political contestation. And as we follow the animals along their journey, we'll begin to see how this web became a matter of international as well as national concern. So the first point of contact with humans for most monkeys caught up in the polio trade was via an animal trap, set somewhere in the forests northeast of Delhi. We don't have much evidence as to how these traps were constructed, although a slightly later account refers to well-built falling traps weighted with rocks. But what we do know is that monkeys would then be transferred to cages made of cut bamboo. They'd be crowded into these cages, fights would break out, and the sharp edges of the bamboo would easily cut the animals. Most trappers couldn't afford to feed the monkeys a great deal. Cages would be filled with starving and often injured animals. So we also know that this trade was associated with a specific group of people in northeast of Delhi, known as the Vangujars. These were a Muslim group, so they were very vulnerable in the politics of immediate post-partition India. They were also nomads in a state trying to orientate itself towards the improvement of sedentary life in villages. The Vangujars weren't even officially recognized as a distinct ethnic group until the mid-1960s. So those who trapped monkeys in the forests of northeast India during the 50s were in fact themselves marginalized. It'd be unfair to frame the relationship between trappers and monkeys in India then as a simple act of human domination of passive animal life. Vangujars lived a hard life, and as forest dwellers, they were also subject to efforts aimed at converting forest land to agriculture. Both monkeys and trappers were faced with threats to their existence at this time, just of different kinds. So the exploitation of Indian monkeys by trappers should be seen in the light of the wider political and economic conditions created through successive colonial and post-colonial regimes of forest management and control that targeted people just as much as it targeted trees and animals. Monkeys would then be taken to collection stations, and once enough would arrive at these, they'd be loaded onto trains and taken to animal dealers' compounds in Delhi. A British Medical Research Council official sent to India to secure supplies of monkeys at this time described the inconsistent circumstances of animal holding facilities in the capital. The variable quality of these, I think, can largely be attributed to the booming trade during the 50s. And as another British official related, he talked about the mushroom growth of dealers who, quote, know nothing about trapping, collection, care, dispatch, or financing. But dealers were also subject to multiple economic pressures. Firstly, trappers had begun demanding more for the monkeys they trapped. Prices rose from around 5 rupees per monkey at the start of 1955 to as much as 27 rupees by the year's end. So dealers were caught between their commitment to supply animals to Western laboratories and the rising price of replacing those they sold on. And some reduced living standards in holding cages in response, feeding less and crowding more monkeys in. But dealers also collaborated. Many had established themselves in Delhi during the colonial period. In fact, many were ex-British colonial officers who shared a common social network. In late 1955, a group of these businessmen sought to agree a maximum price to pay trappers of 10 rupees per monkey. Yet trappers quickly responded by demanding that dealers accept all monkeys offered to them, regardless of injury, malnutrition, or size. Prices rose again in 1956. The second experience that dealers had was that, as well as combating pressures from trappers, they also had to ensure that they operated within the bounds of a newly liberated Indian political discourse. Whilst they might have been respected members of colonial society, this by no means guaranteed them respect in newly independent India. For example, one Congress Party minister described one of the most prominent dealers in Delhi, Mr. T.E. Patterson, as at one point lower than the lowest monkeys. So finally, dealers were also heavily involved in international efforts aimed at securing trade routes out of India and into pharmaceutical laboratories. As the owner of Delhi's largest dealership, Patterson embarked on an extensive lobbying tour of Western governments during 1955. His aim was to persuade British, Canadian, and above all American officials that the best way of keeping monkey prices in check would be to form what he called an international cartel. Unfortunately for Patterson, his ideas were rejected once Canadian diplomats pointed out that the scheme would result in a virtual American monopoly, as US firms consumed by far the most monkeys at this time. So on their arrival at dealerships, monkeys entered spaces shaped not only by their immediate needs and the willingness of dealers to provide for these, but also by the history of their journey to Delhi, the extent to which dealers were able to satisfy the demands of Indian politicians under pressure from animal campaigners, and an increasingly global animal trade in which monkey bodies had suddenly come to be highly valued. Dealers acted as go-betweens and sought to profit from both their local knowledge and their international connections. So, after living a few weeks in dealers' compounds, exporters would pack the healthiest monkeys they could find there into smaller cages for shipment to the West. But whether monkeys would even be allowed out of the country during the mid-1950s was actually by no means certain. A series of publicized incidents involving monkey death and mistreatment, such as the one I mentioned at the start of this talk, increased pressure on ruling Congress Party politicians at this time. And by July 1955, Indian ministers had begun to lose patience with the uncontrolled expansion of the business and a growing sense of scandal around it. That month, they announced a quota system for exports, combined with a requirement that importers give a guarantee of sufficient monkey care during transit. The new Indian policy gave Western diplomats great cause for concern. Without supplies of monkeys, growing public demand for vaccination just couldn't be satisfied. So they began a sustained campaign aimed at keeping monkey supply lines open. For example, all Western nations began to look to establish alternative sources of monkeys at this time. And in Britain, at least, these efforts were intimately bound up with the emergence of the new scientific field of laboratory animal science. As early as 1949, the committee that founded the world's first institution devoted to the standardization of laboratory animal care, known as the Laboratory Animals Bureau, created an experimental depot in Gambia in which monkeys would be held and they hoped bred. And if you look at the bottom right of my screen there, that's actually an image of the Gambia facility as it was built in this brand new then. And this approach was, the committee argued, a long-term policy designed to ensure supplies of monkeys when Indian sources become too difficult or expensive to rely upon. Canada, and especially the US, also used the possibility of getting monkeys out from elsewhere as a negotiating tool. A US delegation suggested that they would simply build supply lines to Pakistan or Nepal if the Indian government decided to limit exports. And ex-colonial officers from Britain even tried to establish alternative dealerships in Dhaka and Lucknow. These, however, failed due to various reasons, but mainly inter-dealer rivalry and a lack of reliable air transportation from these places. So alternative supply lines are actually very difficult to establish without a pre-existing animal trapper and dealer infrastructure. As a frustrated colonial official noted, only India possessed this during the mid-1950s. All efforts in this direction seem to have ended in failure at this time. Another tactic used by Western diplomats was to appeal to the Indian government's humanitarian values. The polio vaccine was, they suggested, a human good that far outweighed any harm that monkeys might experience. Yet this approach actually missed the point of Indian and especially Congress Party objections to the trade. During the 40s and 50s, Nehru had sought to ground the Gandhian politics of ahimsa, or non-violence, as an approach to international relations. And key to his policy was a commitment to neutral friendship with the great powers on the one hand, and a more general opposition to the development of weapons of mass destruction on the other. So one of the most forceful sources of official Indian objection to the trade was the fact that British and American militaries also used rhesus in their nuclear threat testing programs. Yet Western negotiators presented the monkey trade as an unalloyed net good, ignoring or at least minimizing the possibility that monkeys might be used for other purposes than vaccine manufacture. Instead, they caricatured Indian objections as due to Hindu superstition and their poor understanding of science on behalf of Indians. So finally, the final tactic that diplomats used was that it was seeking to control the narrative of care that the Indian government had itself initiated. By confining discussion to shipping conditions, for example, diplomats sought to play to domestic audiences such as the Animal Welfare Institute and the RSPCA, who had a special interest in this area. And in 1955, the Laboratory Animals Bureau proposed a new set of air travel regulations, including minimum cage sizes, maximum numbers of animals per cage, and minimum weights of monkeys. As the head of the Laboratory Animals Bureau, William Lane Petter, put it, they hoped that by doing this, they would be able to take the initiative by showing that British scientists, quote, have a lively interest in seeing that this traffic is properly regulated. And this final tactic actually worked far better than the others. The Medical Research Council proposals were readily accepted by Indian ministers and formed a basis for scientific collaboration between the UK and India going forward. So by the end of 1956, monkeys arriving at Western airports such as London or Idlewild would have entered a space in which their care had increasingly been prioritised. This space wasn't constructed simply in response to Western concerns regarding animal welfare, but was rather the outcome of a sustained series of complex, high-level negotiations between a newly independent Indian government and a roughly allied group of vaccine manufacturing nations in the West. And as a final illustration of this, I want to point to two examples of the way Western scientific ideas of monkey care were as much oriented towards the effective utilization of animals in experimentation as to their proper treatment. My first example concerns a second move to restrict the export of animals by India. The 1955 agreement between British and Indian policymakers about conditions of transportation had stipulated that rhesus under a certain size, that is between 4 and 6 pounds, could be transported in greater numbers in a single cage than could larger animals. And this encouraged importers to rely on juvenile animals, as their size meant they could be brought to Western laboratories in greater numbers. When this fact was pointed out by an Indian Animal Welfare Committee, the Indian government moved to restrict exports of animals under 6 pounds. And this policy immediately increased prices and severely reduced the number of animals leaving the country. In response, Western governments scrambled to assure Indian legislators that monkeys under 6 pounds were indeed useful for medical research. Much back and forth between Western diplomats resulted in a range of justifications for using these juvenile primates. For example, the Americans argued that, in fact, the larger monkeys couldn't be used in their vaccine manufacturing plants, as these plants have been specifically designed for the use of small animals. British scientists, on the other hand, just handed over a list of uses to which younger animals could be put. But it was actually the arguments of scientific advisors in capitalist West Germany that eventually provided the position all diplomats got behind. German scientists argued that far from being unsuited to experimentation, younger animals were in fact more amenable to use in vaccine manufacture. They were, they claimed, lighter, easier to handle, and they healed more quickly. And in fact, they were happier when crowded together in cages rather than transported in pairs or threes. So faced with the unified voices of 4 of the most scientifically sophisticated nations of the 1950s, Indian politicians backed down. The ban on lighter and therefore younger animals was rescinded in 1958, the same year that they'd been introduced. So I think we can see how, unlike Indian concerns about peaceful government and non-harm, early laboratory animal scientists tended to assume that monkey care wasn't so much an end in itself as a means of ensuring that animals were used most efficiently. Of course, this was in part prompted by the quota regime put in place by the Indian government, but it's also the case that such attitudes were consistent with a pre-existing Western framework in which animals were discussed as nothing more than tools. Though they needed to be used with skill and acumen, it was ultimately only insofar as they helped knowledge production and medical science that these animals could be valued. To give one final example of this, an early meeting of the committee that preceded the Laboratory Animals Bureau declared that, quote, experimental animals are test reagents and should be of the highest quality if consistent results are to be obtained. William Lane Petter similarly emphasized that monkey mortality was wasteful rather than simply cruel, and argued that importation conditions should, I quote, represent an example both of efficiency and humanity. So in conflating care and efficiency in this way, Western laboratory animal scientists assumed that using animals as resources that had to be handled with care implied that they would indeed be cared for. And this conception of efficiency-oriented care, in fact, extended far beyond animal bodies themselves. Lane Petter wasn't simply concerned with standardizing care practices, but also with securing global trade routes. And to this end, he recommended what he called improvements to every step of the monkey's journey. Dealers, he argued, need to encourage trappers to treat monkeys better. Dealers themselves should employ veterinary advisors to prevent injury or disease outbreaks. Cage sizes needed to be limited during air transport so more could be fit into cargo holds. And Lane Petter even suggested at one point that monkeys might be killed in India and their biological materials shipped to Western laboratories. So alongside the emergence of laboratory animal science, we can chart the parallel development of an explicitly logistical ethos within experimental biomedicine. Laboratory animal science is concerned, of course, with animal care, but it's just as much concerned with animal supply and use, i.e. with its trade and its coordination. And it should be mentioned that even Lane Petter's ideal and other scientists' ideal of efficient care actually came up against other geopolitical and economic realities of the monkey trade during the 1950s. So British and other Western diplomats were actually deeply skeptical, for example, of the ability of what they thought of as superstitious Hindus to tolerate the killing of monkeys for humanitarian purposes. So they didn't think it would ever be possible for Indian biological science to be established. And also pharmaceutical laboratories at this time were generally more concerned with obtaining monkeys at low prices than with what Lane Petter called the quality of the animals they used. So, to conclude, monkey care practices continue to be seen differently in India and the West during the following decades. Whereas Indian political debates continue to revolve primarily around the extent to which a politics of non-violence could be extended to animal life, Western scientists emphasize the significance of animal care for effective research practice. Early laboratory animal scientists in the West characterized monkey care as a means of conserving the limited number of animals allowed into their countries via India's quota scheme. Ultimately, however, the failure of both Western scientists and diplomats to understand or even acknowledge the underlying reasons for Indian administrators' discomfort meant that they were constantly surprised by the introduction of new regulations and periodic outright bans on the trade. In 1978, India would ban rhesus exports entirely. By that point, a complex set of rules and regulations concerning animal care had built up that targeted many different kinds of laboratory animals. And Western biomedical scientists had begun to appeal to the field of laboratory animal science as an indication that animal welfare was being taken seriously. But what such appeals conveniently forgot was that the motives for understanding animal care in the first place owed a great deal to a set of careful, contested international negotiations over trade conditions appropriate for animals used in vaccine manufacture, as it did to the internal politics of science in the West. As previous historians have pointed out, rhesus breeding and testing had been a small, if important, element of North American and European science during the first half of the 20th century. But in the years following the introduction of the polio vaccine, these animals gained a new prominence in Western scientific culture. Rhesus began to be used in a wide range of vaccine evaluation regimes, but also became more significant in fundamental biomedical research. The National Academy of Science report mentioned at the start of this talk outlines the multiple directions that research has gone since the late 1950s. Similarly, Western ethicists' concern about animal testing began to shift from its earlier discomfort regarding the use of domestic animals such as cats and dogs to the more obviously human-like non-human primates. But despite increased protest about the use of such obviously human-like beings in testing and drug manufacture, the fact was that an infrastructural regime was already in place by the end of the 1950s. Objectors were no longer simply contesting the decisions of individual scientists to use rhesus in their experiments, but an entire industry of rhesus supply and use that spanned continents and incorporated interested actors from multiple cultures and systems of belief. The use of rhesus today isn't sustained only by policymakers' arrival or simply by policymakers' arrival at a rationally agreed scientific and ethical consensus, but rather by the consequences and effects of historical trade agreements and diplomatic negotiations. And it's only by facing these conditions of animal use head-on, that is by analysing the emergence of a logistical regime of rhesus supply, that it becomes possible, I think, to imagine a landscape of scientific research that's no longer troubled by its use of these clearly intelligent, emotionally engaged animals. Whether we wish to do so or not is, of course, another question. So finally, thinking about the history of laboratory animals through this logistical lens encourages to reframe their lives and the stories we tell about them, not just in terms of a singular relationship between experimenter and experimental subject, but also requires that we consider the multiple, many-layered stories involving far more diverse actors than experimental scientists and laboratory animal professionals that they became associated with on their journey into experimental spaces. And what I want to do as my project moves forward is to start to think about species that are more closely associated with breeding programs and standardization. So dogs to a certain extent, but also more industrialized animals such as mice and rats in similar terms, in terms of these longer trajectories through which they've been made abundant in scientific contexts. Doing so, I think, will invite reconsideration of the conditions of possibility of our contemporary materia medica, and thereby deepen our appreciation of the entanglement of modern health within colonial and environmentally contentious legacies. So thanks so much for listening.